ultimately, I think there has to be changes in law where if someone dies, like Al Bishak, like those in Grenfell, because of a landlord's lack of action or negligence, that should be deemed corporate negligence by any definition. They should go to jail. They should fundamentally go to jail. We should live in a country where it's considered nobody is above the law. But for some, clearly, for businesses, for organisations, for these big management companies, that's not included for them. Housing affects every single one of us, and I've said it from when I first started campaigning, whether you are a rough sleeper or you own a 5-bedroom house. Housing affects all of us, and it's something that we all need as a basic, as a fundamental to progress in life. And that's why I've said it's as important as it is, yet for a very long time it hasn't received that respect, especially politically. And in fact, we've turned it into this idea of having a commodity, having an asset, rather than a necessity, a fundamental for all of us. And that's what really annoys me, what really angers me, because I've experienced not having it. And at the moment, it's become more of a luxury rather than a necessity. And it should never have been that. It's just as important as food, water, the air we breathe. Shelter is a need for all of us.
We've just changed Parliament and we've got a new government, and we'll get on to what Labour have announced just yesterday in the King's Speech. But I wanted to talk to you about the previous government.
Yeah.
And you dedicate quite a large bit of this book actually to the way that the Conservatives, and actually not just the Conservatives, cross-party, how housing was treated during that Parliament. And I was interested in what you were saying about diversity. To me, it felt like you were saying that there wasn't enough people in Parliament who understood what it was like to not have a house. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I spoke specifically about the lack of class diversity, I think. And I know I mentioned, of course, there are people in Westminster who are from working class backgrounds or were from working class backgrounds. But I still feel that there's an absolute disconnect. I don't look at Westminster and see anyone that looks like me or looks like my friends or shares the same experiences as us, or at least I don't know that. We haven't been told that. And that's what I mean in terms of diversity. If we're going to be truly representative and claim to be truly representative of a nation, then you have to truly represent the whole nation and not completely miss out a large chunk of it. So that's what I meant by that. I want to see more people in Westminster that look like me, that I find relatable. I mean, growing up, I never sat down and watched Prime Minister's Questions or any of that. I thought it was a whole load of nonsense because there was no reason for me to do so, or so I thought. There was no one in there that looked like me, that actually inspired me to want to focus on politics, watch those type of shows, watch Prime Minister's Questions, engage in politics. There was none of that. Yet politics affects all of us. Policies affect all of us, especially poor policies. And when I say poor policies, I mean affecting those from working class backgrounds the most.
When you see someone like Angela Rayner, who's now just become the Deputy Prime Minister, when you see her in the House, do you feel represented by her?
I mean, being from a working class background, and especially from a social housing background too, there is that element. And I think there are a lot of people that are proud that she is in the position she is in now. And I think it's an absolutely good thing. If there's anyone that's going to get why social housing is important and the benefit it can have towards our lives, then it's going to be her, because she's been through it and she's spoken openly about that. So yeah, I do think that is inspiring. I think there has to be more diversity, though. There has to be more of a push. I want young people going to schools that I used to go to or teach at to be able to look at politics and think, you know what, one day I can get there, I can do that, I want to be able to do that. I want to be in those rooms having conversations around issues that are affecting me now. But that isn't there. We haven't got there yet. I mean, when we look at the sort of diversity tick boxes, when it comes to Westminster, you look at race and all of these other characteristics, but we don't really focus on class. And perhaps if there was more class diversity in Westminster, policies would be better informed. There would be more diversity when it comes to discussions around policies, different angles, different perspectives. People that have been through struggles and challenges informing policies. Those are the sort of policies that are going to be the best and most informed, I personally believe. So that's why I think it's important.
How do we get there? How do you start encouraging people? Or how do people from your school discover that they can actually get into Parliament? How do we work out a route for people to move that way?
I think it's definitely the responsibility of Parliament and politicians to do that and make it clear that anyone can get into politics. Anyone should be able to believe that they can get into politics too. Politics affects all of us, right? And regardless of age too, the subject I talk about, housing, talk about kids a lot and the impact on kids, young people who aren't even old enough to vote. Politics and policies still impact them, and often negatively, but also people who are 80, 90. I've spoken to individuals that have really suffered because of a lack of housing, homelessness, or living in poor conditions who are of that age. It still affects them then. So I think we should be having conversations with everyone around politics and going into schools and speaking to them. I think actually there needs to be a change in education. I think we should be teaching kids from year 7 upwards about politics, because it's an important subject. It impacts all of us. Often we don't have conversations around poor living conditions or struggles or issues that families are going through, especially with young people, but we should, because they are going through it. They're the ones being affected by it, and it all comes back down to politics, and that's what needs to be made clear. So I want to see politics taught at a younger age within education and mainstream education first and foremost, and hopefully that will help inspire young people from different backgrounds, different demographics, different classes to feel like, actually, you know what, I want to go in there and I want to change something that's affected me, something that I've been through, watch my parents go through. That's the way that we really change things, I believe.
There's a possibility there that we might start rioting.
Well, yeah, I mean, the French, we've been seeing what's been going on in France, right? And people did become very sick and tired, especially after the last few years. But I think we got to a point where everyone in this country just accepted it. And when we said things couldn't get worse, and I hate saying that now, although I always do because it does seem to get worse, people just accepted it. It was just going on for so long that even now, right, with a new government in over the last 12, 13, 14 days, plans have been introduced. And I mean, 15, 20 years ago, we may have thought, oh, they're quite basic. But now everyone's like, oh my gosh. And that's because we've been through such a period in time where there has been so much struggling and suffering that people only ever expected the worst. And it should have never been like that.
It definitely feels like the last 15 years has been a period of deterioration. And I think you can see that physically in the homes that you've put on your social media, the homes that you've been, you know, well, you're now a journalist now, you know, the homes that you've been covering. Do you think that there's something in the way that, how do I phrase this? Why do you think it got so bad over the last 15 years? Why do you think that you were going into people's homes and finding them flooded and finding them full of mould?
First reason being it was never a priority. Second reason being politicians in Westminster weren't going through it. Perhaps if they were going through it, things would have changed a lot quicker. Third reason, we had several different governments that all were Conservative, and there was this idea around housing that it should all be home ownership. But I think it's a mixture of those three things, especially because, I mean, I've spoken to MPs who have said for years these sorts of issues has taken up the majority of their casework for such a long time, and they've been aware of it. They've known it has existed, and the greatest shame is Grenfell. And Grenfell, these politicians lined the streets. They all came out, right? They all took to the streets promising things would change, policies would change. We would never allow anything like Grenfell to ever happen again. The conditions of people and the conditions, especially those living in social housing, has to change. There has to be more regulation around that. And then 5 years on, myself, other mainstream news journalists are going into people's homes and showing they are living in equally as slum conditions and being treated in the same way that those that were living in Grenfell had complained about prior to the Grenfell fire happening. If that's not a failure and a monumental failure on behalf of government, then I don't know what is. And still, even now, Grenfell survivors are still waiting for justice to be served.
Mm-hmm. And the building is still there.
Yeah, which shows a lack of priority, which shows a lack of care. Even after that, that was supposed to be the catalyst for change. And even that didn't seem to be enough.
What will be enough?
Honestly, sometimes I ask myself the same question. I would have hoped that, I mean, the humanity in all of us would have said enough is enough and things have to change. As a politician too, I know certainly, had I been in that government, that would have been my priority, wanting to deliver change to make sure that never happened again. And had I been in government, or the government that just, the Conservative government that has just left now, I would feel a massive sense of shame and embarrassment and failure, especially towards the Grenfell community, because that should have been enough. And still, they wait with a new government in now.
And then a few years later, after we're all very aware of the cladding crisis, after everyone is, you know, totally aware of the dangers of flammable cladding, you then move on to this next crisis, which is damp and mould. And there was a 2-year-old boy who died in his home in Rochdale because the walls were so wet and the mould was so bad in his home that it killed him. And you dedicate this book to him, don't you? I mean, how many crises can we uncover in housing? We've got cladding, we've got mould. What else are you seeing?
I mean, there's different layers to this. And I mean, a young, vulnerable 2-year-old boy didn't even get to make it to his 3rd birthday, living in a home filled with damp and mould. His parents had been complaining before he was even born, and they were blamed for ritual bathing being a cause of that damp and mould. They were blamed for those conditions, even though others on their estate were living in equally as bad conditions. Even years later, it was found out that people were still living with mould in their homes. But before that point, everyone was blamed for having damp and mould in their home. Open your windows, stop drying your clothes indoor, ritual bathing. This has been going on for generations. The gaslighting has been absolutely insane. And it took a 2-year-old boy to die, have his life cut short, for them to realise, for them to find mould in his lungs and in his blood to prove that damp and mould in your home can kill you. It should never have taken that. But even now, I still receive messages from people living in homes filled with damp and mould, years on. And so many other issues. I've been into homes where I've had to wear Sainsbury's bags on my shoes to cover my shoes because I was ankle deep in raw sewage.
But that's the point, isn't it? We're not talking about a couple of specks of black mould on the wall that you can paint over. We're talking about, it almost looks like you're going into a Victorian sewer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've wiped walls in my bare hands and my fingers have been covered in black mould. That's how bad it is. I mean, I've been into one home in Birmingham where every single wall and door was black and it was formerly white because it was all covered in mould and damp, and there was members of staff that had been into those homes several times and left and didn't come back to address the issues. But this issue of disrepair goes far wider than that. We talk about damp and mould a lot, and as we should, but I've taken people to A&E because ceilings have caved in on top of them. People living with leaks constantly whenever it rains, people having mushrooms growing in their home because it's so damp, cockroach infestations, mice infestations, spider infestations. The list of disrepair goes on, and we have a decent home standard, right? But then when you look at the decent home standard of what a decent home is, half the things that I see going into these people's homes isn't even included on that list. But no one, absolutely no one, would consider the homes that I've been in decent in any way. And that's what I mean. There hasn't been enough follow-ups. There hasn't been enough changes in policy, especially around what's considered a decent home. And ultimately, it's cost people's lives. I've spoken about that in the book, and I said it from the very first day I started campaigning. People are dying in their homes because of the conditions they are being forced to live in, whilst also paying rent to live in those conditions.
And there's no accountability.
No.
It doesn't feel like, if you are, okay, so a couple of the schemes that have been set up, one by the Mayor of London and one that's going to be coming in from the Labour government, are these hubs that you can go to, where you can go and register your grievance and you'll get legal counsel, because most normal people can't afford to instruct a lawyer to take on their landlord. But I mean, is that enough? it feels to me that we're in a space at the moment. We've just had the post office scandal, which is another, I would argue, actually is quite similar to the housing scandal. There are civil servants, there are big bosses, there are people who are making money, and no one takes any accountability. So what process do we need for housing? I mean, should people go to prison if they provide these sort of conditions?
Absolutely. I mean, I've said from day dot that should be the case. Had this been a private landlord, they probably would. Or had it been in the NHS and it was a doctor and nurse treating their patients in such a way, they'd be struck off first and foremost, wouldn't be allowed to work in the sector again. And there could be criminal prosecutions against them, especially if it led to someone's death. It should absolutely be the same in public housing, and I don't know why it is not, because that would act as a deterrent, an incentive, right, to make sure people are living in decent and safe homes. We've got chief executives making six-figure salaries, going back to their ivory towers, whilst the same people they are there to provide a service to are living in slum conditions in the sixth richest economy in the world. And we talk about the help out there. Once upon a time we had legal aid for people that were struggling. Now that's not the case. I've had people in tears on the phone who say they can't get legal aid and they don't know what to do, and they're struggling to find a solicitor to take up their case because they're simply ignored and they're not helped. And I mean, these same housing providers walk all over MPs too, I have to say, because an MP will send them a letter, they will know exactly how to respond and what to send back, and then months later that same family is having to write to their MP again to say nothing's actually been done. And the MP's power is quite restricted in what they can force that landlord and provider to do. And I think MPs should have much more stronger say, especially when it comes to housing in their constituencies. But ultimately, I think there has to be changes in law where if someone dies, like Al Bishak, like those in Grenfell, because of a landlord's lack of action or negligence, that should be deemed corporate negligence by any definition. They should go to jail. They should fundamentally go to jail. We should live in a country where it's considered nobody is above the law. But for some, clearly, for businesses, for organisations, for these big management companies, that's not included for them.
Because the only solution, one that you found, is to shame them.
Yeah.
And so the onus is really on the individual to create a viral moment, and then something gets done about it. How quickly is the turnaround when something does go, when something goes big on the internet, someone's wet home? How quick is the turnaround then?
Well, I mean, for me, that's really what carried the campaign, is people on social media who had followed me being so outraged and calling out these providers and disgracing them on social media, and then MPs picking it up that way. And it was that element of shame that really changed things for me and accelerated things, because I could have done things differently and could have still been here a year later and not achieved what I have over the last sort of 3 years. And that's because of that shame element. And there's been instances where someone's been complaining for 10 years, 12 years, and I've gone in, videoed, uploaded it to social media, 48 hours, then moved out. There was one incident on my own estate, a lady had been complaining 27 years. 27 years, that's longer than I've been alive. And then as soon as it went on the news, on social media, situation sorted. Yeah, they did what they were supposed to do. And the thing is, these providers would have seen the conditions, these chief executives would have seen the conditions that they were in, but the gaslighting is insane when you have members of staff coming into your home that's fallen apart and telling you it's all in your head. That, well, actually, these issues, I know you've got mice, but you should pay for that and deal with it yourself, even though it's in your tenancy agreement that it's their responsibility. Or, no, I know your kitchen's 100 years old and you've got wood lice, but what we'll do is we'll pull that off the wall, deal with the mice and stick that back on anyhow.
The landlord makes you feel dirty as well.
Yeah.
For having these things.
Yep, and I've heard conversations with members of staff where they blame the tenants, call the tenants disgusting, say it's down to their lifestyle. I mentioned Al Bishak and the damp and mould and how it was ritual bathing, whatever that is.
Ritual
bathing, basically saying that they're bathing with buckets.
I'm just a Catholic and I just went full John the Baptist. I was like, what are they doing in there? I know what you mean.
They call it ritual bathing, and I know exactly why.
So
it's an immigrant
bathroom,
family who's moved here to the UK, saying that they're flooding the bathroom with buckets full of water instead of bathing traditionally with a shower or with in the bath. I don't know what exactly they're trying to insinuate, but it's down to discrimination ultimately, and that's what it was deemed where in the Ombudsman reports and several other reports after Alib's death. But there's been several instances of that, and it's been deep rooted in discrimination. But even with the ritual bathing point, right, there has been times where my showers stopped working and I've had to stand in the bath and use a bucket or like a towel to wash myself. There's been instances of that. There's been also instances where residents have had to do that because they complained to their landlord about their shower not working and that landlord's not come out. But it's also like drying your clothes indoors, right? Tenants, especially in social housing, are blamed for damp and mould. It's never down to the quality of the buildings and the places that they live in as to why damp and mould's grown in their properties, or the leaks that they've been complaining about for ages that's not been dealt with. It's always down to their lifestyle choices. And when it comes to drying their clothes indoors, I'll say now I dry my clothes indoors. And well, during the winter, I think everyone pretty much dries their clothes
where
indoors.
else would you put it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
where else are you going to put it? Especially if you live in a tower block.
Yeah.
Because you're not allowed to put it on your balcony because it's an eyesore and you get in trouble by your landlord. But also you can't dry it
Forgot
indoors.
all about that, yeah.
Yeah. So this whole idea of people don't dry their clothes indoors, absolutely they do. Even these housing providers and landlords, they dry their clothes indoors, but they don't have this issue of damp and mould. As soon as you're a social housing tenant and you've got damp or mould in your home, it's because you're drying your clothes indoors. There was one instance actually where a family was severely overcrowded, had damp and mould in their home, and a member of staff said to them, yeah, there's too many of you here and you're breathing too much, there's too much condensation.
Breathing
that's
too
why.
much?
Yeah. So that individual then turned around and said, okay, which one of my kids should I kill first to stop this damp and mould from growing? That's the sort of contempt these individuals treat tenants and those living in social housing with. And it's rotten. It's a rotten, absolutely rotten culture. And the only way that culture can change is by government, by regulation, getting rid of the stigma around social housing and the assumption. I mean, shows like Benefit Street and How to Get a Council Home really didn't help, and that only fed that stigma. I refer to that as poverty porn, and that's absolutely what it was. And years later, after Grenfell, after Al Bishak, and after the news going into people's homes, myself going into people's homes, we've actually realised that people have been suffering for such a long time. Yet even then, people were trying to make entertainment out of their situations. That's the culture. That's how rotten it's been. And that is what needs to change. That's the hardest thing that's going to change, but that is our foundations. And I'm looking towards government. I hope Angela Rayner is able to change that stigma and that culture around social housing as someone that's lived in it and understands the benefits, because it should never exist. And that's what's allowed people to suffer in the way that they have, but also be ignored.
It's interesting what you went, just going back to what you said about discrimination when you were talking about this ritual bathing. Within the King's Speech, under the housing subsection that Labour were talking about, they were talking about discrimination, and they were talking about how they're going to make it illegal for a landlord to refuse certain tenants. Typically, I mean, a landlord can just decide if they don't want someone living there and they can throw them out. Have you seen cases of that?
Oh, absolutely, especially in the private sector. There's been landlords, right? So there's been tenants who are homeless. They go to their local authority and then they are pushed into the private sector, and they have to go to viewings. They go to these viewings and it's predominantly Black and Asian tenants. Those are the ones that I've spoken to. And then for whatever reason, days later, when it comes to them deciding if they want to take the property or not, and often it is they want to take it, the landlords refused, or the landlords said, oh, all of a sudden they're selling up and they can't. In fact, recently actually, there was one lady who I'm still talking to and trying to help now. She still hasn't found permanent housing. But that's the process that was followed, and she was offered a property in the private sector. She went to view it, she was going to take it. The landlord then turned around and said they were selling up. Anyway, she went down that road about a week later, week and a half later, to find another family had been moved in to that property. So the landlord didn't sell up, clearly didn't like the look of her or her family, and decided, no, they're not living in this property. And that's what happens all the time. And councils are paying those same landlords premium rates for those properties too.
That's what I think. If more people really understood that, I think that they would be really up in arms. That the council really does pay through the nose to these private landlords to rent out their properties, more sometimes than it is market value,
Yeah.
and they get that off the council. That's your taxpayer money that's being used to fund this man's wallet.
£2 billion this year is going to be spent on temporary accommodation from the private sector. £2 billion.
And then you still have this sort of this rhetoric that landlords are doing you a favour, that they are actually almost charity workers by letting out their properties in the first place.
What did I heard an interview yesterday where one turned around and said they're actually the fourth emergency service.
No.
And basically that tenants should be more grateful. And the thing is, even in the private sector, I mean, going on to the private sector, that's a crisis in itself, but it also affects social housing. People are struggling to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and also pay their landlord at the end of the month. People are having their rents hiked and have had their rents hiked several times over the last year. We've got some of the highest private rents on record. And not only that, on top of that, we've got Section 21 notices that a landlord can just dish out whenever they like. No reason whatsoever as to why they want you out of their home. They just want you out, so they'll serve you a notice. Then you can't find anywhere else to privately rent because everywhere else is too expensive. So where do you turn? To the local authority. But you've got 1.3 million people in a queue ahead of you. I know I mentioned it in the book. We've got 145,000 homeless kids in England, and that is enough to fill the O2 Arena more than 7 times over. And those stuck in temporary accommodation, the numbers only increasing. I mean, since 2019, we've had 55 child deaths because of the temporary accommodation that they've been living in. Often it's poor conditions. It's got the issues of damp and mould. It's a converted garage. It's a converted storage container. It's overcrowded. It's in disrepair. And the private sector has a role to play in that, because a lot of these homes that the council are renting off of a private landlord, many of them that I've been into have been in poor conditions. And we already know 1 in 4 homes in the private rented sector doesn't meet the decent home standard. And it's similar in social housing. So even those stuck in temporary accommodation often are living in slum conditions, but they don't want to complain out of fear. And that fear is they won't get the social housing that they need, or they won't get the permanent accommodation that they need. And out of fear, therefore, they end up living in those conditions which nobody should be subject to, slum conditions. And again, in many cases, while councils are paying out of their backsides for these properties from the private sector.
Can you explain temporary accommodation in layman's terms? Because I don't think that people really understand that. Like when you're home, you are homeless because you're being moved place to place. Can you sort of explain that? Yeah.
So when you're homeless and you go to, I've been in temporary accommodation before, and it was again poor conditions, something I talk about in the book. But when you go to your local authority now and you've been made homeless, often they'll place you in temporary accommodation. That could be temporary accommodation they own, or in many cases temporary accommodation provided by the private sector. And you'll be in there until they can find you permanent social housing, or find you a place, which often happens again, a permanent place in the private rented sector. And you could be in there for years. I've spoken to families where there's kids within those families, and for their whole life. I mean, the 12-year-old, for example, has been living in temporary accommodation for their whole life. So there's nothing temporary about it. And often you're moved. It could be after a few weeks, it could be after a few years. And sometimes that temporary accommodation is a hotel room. And with that hotel room, every 28 days you're moved to another hotel or another hotel room. So you have to pack up your belongings and move your stuff. So there's different forms of temporary accommodation. But even the hotels, there's been many instances where those rooms are in poor conditions too. And what's worse is people often have a much difficult time in hotel temporary accommodation, because every week your local authority has to pay for that room for you, but they forget, or they don't manage it. And what happens is you get a knock on your door in the morning by hotel staff that tell you, right, you need to move out. They haven't paid for your stuff. You thinking that they're going to renew your stay for another week or another 2 weeks, you pack your stuff up, sitting in the lobby waiting to hear back from the council because they've failed to do their jobs. I can't tell you the amount of times I've received calls of people in tears saying that they don't know where to go because the hotel hasn't extended their stay. And there's been several instances of it.
And even if it is working smoothly, you'll have children, like the Peckham school that you're talking about, that has a disproportionately high number of children who are de facto homeless. they'll wake up in one hotel room one morning, and then when they get picked up from school that evening, they'll be somewhere completely different, and it's not necessarily even in the same borough.
No.
It could be miles away.
Yeah, I mean, we were told, this was years ago, things are much worse now, that we were in our final year studying, that we were going to have to pack our stuff up and move to Luton. Had I ever been to Luton in my life before that point? No, I'd only ever been in London, but there are many instances where kids have to be pulled out of school.
You were doing your A-levels at the time, weren't you? And your sister was doing her GCSEs.
Yeah.
So you're in critical exam time there. You're in like a really pivotal point in your lives, and that's happening to you.
They don't care. It's not. That's what I mean. It's not taken into consideration. People's situation and circumstances aren't considered. If you're a child and you're studying, it doesn't matter if you're in your final year. They don't take that into consideration. If you want a home, you pack your stuff up and move to the north of England, where we've got something. And you'd be grateful for that. And if you're not happy with doing that, we will say you refused to take that property and we will discharge our duty. We don't have to help you no more. That's what happens.
And sitting all day, waiting.
Yeah, there was one instance which absolutely horrified me where I actually showed up to a local authority and it was Hounslow Council, I believe. I'm sure it was, with a homeless individual. We walked in there was no staff available but 2 phones, and we were there for about 5 hours. It came to the end of the day, security wanted to lock up, and I said, right, so where do we go? And he said, well, normally we send anyone that's here, by the end of the day, homeless individuals, to the local police station.
What?
To the local police station to wait for a phone call. That is what happens. And I spoke only a few days ago where to a group of individuals where they say it's not just police stations, they will send you to A&E too and tell you to wait there. Well, that's what I mean. Nothing. You're allowed to sit in that space and hope someone calls you back, but often they don't. Otherwise, you're on the streets. And that's what I mean. These local authorities love to push their responsibility onto other sort of public sector areas that are already struggling. The NHS spends last year spent £1.4 billion looking after people as a result of living in poor conditions. 38 million looking after those who had adverse health conditions as a result of living in homes with damp and mould. So they're paying out of their nose for something which isn't their responsibility either. I mean, NHS bosses only earlier this year said the government can't claim to have fixed the NHS without first and foremost fixing the housing crisis and those living in poor conditions that have to come to us for help. And then we turn to education, kids being pulled out of school, kids being moved from hotel to hotel, can't receive a decent level of education, often from disadvantaged backgrounds anyway. This housing issue isn't a lone and an isolated issue. It affects other areas of people's lives, often mental health too. People dropping out of work and university because mentally they are struggling with their living circumstances, having to live in poor conditions, being ignored, being gaslit, and being treated less than. It has a toll on their mental health, and then they can't even get mental health support for that. The amount of people that have reached out to me and told me they are on the brink of taking their own life because they cannot continue. People have actually taken their own lives because of their living circumstances. That's how much it impacts someone's life. That's how important and crucial it is to the lives of every single one of us. Because then when you don't have it, you realise how much you struggle as an individual. And far too many people don't have access to a safe, decent and affordable home in this country. It's a luxury. It's become like the Hunger Games, bidding wars in the private sector.
None of this gets spoken about in the House of Commons often. I think that the conversation is often simplified or filibustered. You know, the moment that we start talking about affordable housing for people, which we can get onto that if we want to, because that's another farce in itself. But the minute we start talking about it, we get into this silly sort of cul-de-sac of, well, you know, if people want to spend their money renting homes, then they shouldn't buy, you know, total rubbish every day. They shouldn't be eating lunch out every day. And then the conversation just gets shut down. And we're back to where we started. I mean, why do you think that we're in this total infinity loop of not being able to speak about this issue properly? The issues that you're presenting we're actually talking about a humanitarian crisis. You know, that's
a human right.
It is. You know, we're not talking about surface level issues here. This is a deep crisis. Why aren't we talking about it? Again,
it comes back to politics and their lack of conversation around it. For generations, it's all been about home ownership. Certainly from Margaret Thatcher's government, we see it every election cycle, and it hasn't worked for the last 40 years. It's certainly not going to work for the next 5, especially when we're facing the biggest housing crisis since the Second World War. But it comes down to the doorstep of government, their lack of conversation. They are aware these issues have been growing. They haven't just showed up overnight. They haven't just shown up overnight. They've existed. They've been allowed to fester. They've been allowed to build. And now we find ourselves at this tipping point, which it never should have gotten to. But again, it comes back down to the lack of experience with this issue from politicians, the lack of direct experience, I think, not having gone through it. That's why I do this, because I've gone through it. I know what it's like. I've experienced it firsthand. I understand why it needs to change. But still, they ram this idea of home ownership. It's like our version of the American dream. Everyone needs their picket fence and their own home. When you're a student coming out of university in tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt, you're living at home with your parents. Or, if you're lucky enough, you're able to move out because you've got a job. If you're lucky enough to have found a job, a decent job, a decent paying job, then you're struggling to pay your landlord every month. You can't afford to save up and also pay your landlord and also clothe yourself, feed yourself, have a normal life. You can't afford that. Yet still they will shove this idea of you can own your own home. We'll make sure you can own your own home. Off of the back of a cost of living crisis, a global pandemic, own your own home. That's all they shove down our throat without recognising that people cannot own their own home if first and foremost they cannot save, because they cannot afford to rent the roof over their head currently. They cannot afford to pay their bills. They cannot afford to pay off their student debt, their student loan. They cannot afford to also live a normal life. This is the process that they fail to understand. They're still pushing this idea of a British version of an American dream, own your own home. It's a flawed idea, and they fail to identify where the true crisis is, what we actually have to tackle first. And all you have to do is look at countries like Singapore, look at places like Vienna, their social housing, their rental sector, Germany even. And people live over there and are happy renters. They have the stability, they have the affordability, they have the security that they need. And that's all people want from housing in this country, but are being denied, especially renters. And there are so many renters. There are more renters in the UK than there are mortgage holders or homeowners at the moment. Yet still, it's not. Really? Yeah, that it was carried out by Sky News earlier this year, and that data came out where there's more renters than mortgage holders or homeowners. Yet still, politically, what's the one thing they're talking about when it comes to housing? Well, up until recently anyway, own your own home. Doesn't matter how much you're struggling, we can make sure you own your own home. We'll give you 90% discount on a mortgage. If people cannot even afford to save up, then regardless of how much you give them off of a mortgage, how easy you make it, they're not going to be able to afford that and continuing to keep a roof over their head now, living a decent life, not falling into poverty. That's what they have to understand and realise.
So what next? What do you want to see from the Labour government?
Well, I hope the Labour government deliver on their promises in the King's speech. I hope they go further. I hope eventually we see the end of the right to buy scheme, which is the most damaging policy that was introduced in relation to housing, I'd argue, in recent history.
Which is so interesting because it's also it polls it so well. It's the
most
popular policy.
And politicians know this, and that's why it's still around. But it's been the most damaging. We've knocked down and sold off, and this has been consecutively year after year. We've knocked down and sold off through right to buy more homes than we've built, more social homes, yet we've got a growing crisis where we've got 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. In fact, there was even after the right to buy was introduced, the housing minister at the time, his son, it was found out in 2013, owned more than 40 ex-council properties on a single estate in South London. Yet working class people were promised that the right to buy was for them, allowing them to own their own home. We were promised that the homes would be replaced, and people forget that was a huge part of the policy. They failed to do that. The policy has been an absolute failure, and it's continuing to ruin people's lives now. People make the point, well, 2 million working class individuals managed to own their own home, but at the expense of what? 145,000 homeless kids now, 1.3 million working class people waiting to get into social housing.
Or living in those homes now.
Or living in those homes paying extortionate rents because there's a private landlord who can charge whatever they like.
Yeah.
Or the fact that I think it's 1/3 or 2/3 of all homes, those right to buy homes, now have fallen into the private sector. It's one of the two, but that wasn't supposed to happen with this scheme, but it has. It's therefore been a monumental failure, and it will continue to. If government's serious about tackling this crisis, and it starts with social housing, it absolutely starts with social housing. There has to be understanding that you cannot fill a bucket up whilst there's holes in the bottom of it. And that's essentially what is happening within social housing with the right to buy still there. If you are serious, you will suspend it. You will end it. You will find an alternative to allow working class people to get onto the property ladder if they want to, but not at the expense of social housing that is supposed to be there as a safety net for British people up and down the country. And they have to recognise that. I know in Manchester, Andy Burnham's talking about suspending the right to buy scheme up there. I think it's an absolute great decision. And if Labour were able to deliver that, I'd 1,000% support it. And I don't say that because I want to gain anything from it. I say that because I understand where the crisis is. I understand the damage it has caused and damage it continues to cause to the individuals that I meet on a daily basis. That's why that scheme has to go. But they fundamentally also need to be building quality social homes, not just knocking up whatever they like. Because I've often been into some of these homes that have been new builds too. One example is a new build that was put up in 2018 after Grenfell, went in there, filled with damp and mould, corroded pipes, burst water mains because of the corroded pipes, just fall into absolute bits, and there's been several instances of that. Now, if we think we've got a housing crisis now and the government failed to make sure we're building quality, high quality homes, then 20 years from now they're going to have to rip down all the homes they're going to be putting up because they would have fallen apart at a quicker rate than older homes have fallen apart.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Because we've had this now with successive prime ministers. It's not about it's sort of putting a quick bit of sellotape over the whole, because it's not, when you talk about homes that only can last 20 years, actually that's all right for a prime minister, because they'll go, well, in my time in office I built X many homes. It doesn't matter that they're in disrepair now. No one's blaming that on me. That's the attitude that we've had.
It's short-termism. It really is short-termism, and we need a government that is stable. We need a government that's thinking longer than just a term or 2 terms or 3 terms, but actually perhaps thinking about a legacy and the legacy of their party. But moreover, they should be thinking about what the people of this country deserve, what they need, why they elected them. Because politicians, every 5 years or whenever there's an election, will go out begging all of us for their votes, convincing us that they will deliver for us. And now what we need to say is, right, we've given you our votes. This is what we need. You know this is a crisis. You're talking about economic prosperity and economic growth. You cannot do that until you fix this housing crisis and make sure everyone up and down the country has a decent, safe and affordable place to live. And I'm talking specifically about those in the rented sector, social housing and private rented sector at the moment. Because for far too many of them, and I'm talking about millions of people, they do not have that. They do not have the security. They do not have the stability. They do not have the safety and affordability when it comes to housing. And that has to change fundamentally. It's not just, it won't just have economic benefits for government, but it's morally the right thing to do. And I know often politics doesn't deal in morals and what's morally beneficial. But if they're going to deliver the growth that they're promising, if they're going to deliver the change that we need, if they're going to make sure every single child, even those from disadvantaged backgrounds, has an equal opportunity of receiving a decent level of education, or fixing the NHS, for example, by reducing the costs they're having to spend on looking after people because of their poor homes, or the mental health crisis that is a direct result of people and them struggling with their conditions and their lack of access to homelessness, then they have to deliver what's best, what's needed. They have to really tackle the heart of this housing crisis, and it starts with a bottom-up approach. You cannot fix or you cannot build anything on broken foundations, and I've said this directly to Angela Rayner. You cannot build a house on broken foundations. You cannot fix this country and deliver growth or what it is that we need if we have and still have broken foundations. And at the moment, our foundations have been absolutely decimated.
And you'll be holding their feet to the fire.
Yes, yeah. I would be trying my best anyway, but
I'd be so scared of you if I was a politician. Your voice is so loud in the space and just so articulate. I'd be terrified.
Thank you. But I mean, I have to admit, I am optimistic. I'm glad we've got Angela Rayner in the position that we do, and I think there are a lot of working class people and people living in social housing that are proud too and optimistic. I just hope she's able to deliver it. And she has to understand that there are people out there, there are campaigners, there are campaign groups who want her to succeed, who want the government to succeed with this, because ultimately they are succeeding on behalf of the people that we all campaign on a daily basis, and they are delivering for them. That should ultimately be the goal. So hopefully she does remember that. I mean, it's a big mountain to climb. It's the biggest crisis this government is facing. We have to remember that they cannot fix it overnight, but as long as they do it in the right way, then I think they do deserve the support. But we also have to make sure we hold their feet to the fire and make sure that they are delivering and actually delivering what's best for people up and down the country and in the right way.
Great. The book's out now, isn't it?
It is out. It's literally out today. Our Country in Crisis, and it includes everything I've just spoken about, or we've just spoken about, and more, but also, as well as it talking about real life issues, real life situations where people have suffered or died, I want it to act as a manifesto for change too. There are also suggestions and pointers for politicians, for government, for readers to realise that there are examples of this working, of this being fixed, of social housing working, of housing being a priority and seen as a necessity. And I hope that's what people take from this book, and I hope it does go on to help change things.